To save their dying dynasty, Monaco bought a penniless French count to breed an heir. But the perfect groom hid a fatal secret. He belonged to the gay underground. From stealing crown jewels to fund his male lovers, to being banished by the very son he was hired to create. This is the disastrous true story of Prince Pierre, the most expensive lavender marriage in royal history. In 1919, the Grimaldi dynasty stood on the precipice of extinction. Before it became the billionaire's playground of yachts and casinos, Monaco was a fragile operatic state, teetering on political annihilation. A man like Pierre de Polignac, a creature of refined taste and ancient lineage, was about to agree to become a glorified stud for a family of rough-and-tumble sailors. But why? The answer lies in the sheer desperation of the time. The First World War had just ravaged Europe, destroying empires and rewriting maps, and the French Republic was in no mood to tolerate a strategic harbor on its southern coast being ruled by a potential enemy. And that was exactly the problem facing Prince Louis II, the heir to the throne. He had no legitimate children, and his heir presumptive was a German cousin, the Duke of Urac. The French government issued a terrifying ultimatum that echoed through the empty halls of the palace. Fix your succession crisis, or we will annex you. Monaco would cease to exist. Panic is a powerful motivator, and for Prince Louis II, it was the driving force of his existence. He was a rough man, a soldier who had spent his life in the French army, far more comfortable in a barracks than a ballroom. He had no interest in the stifling etiquette of court life, and his personal life was a disaster by royal standards. Decades earlier, while stationed in Algeria, he had fallen passionately in love with a cabaret singer named Marie Juliette Louvet. Some whispered she was a laundress, others a hostess, but regardless of her profession, she was distinctly not royal. From this illicit union came a daughter, Charlotte, a wild, dark-eyed girl born in the harsh sun of Constantine, North Africa, far from the manicured gardens of Monte Carlo. For years, Charlotte was the family's dirty little secret, but now with the French threat looming, she became their only lifeline. Louis had no choice but to legally adopt his own illegitimate daughter, granting her the title Duchess of Valentinois and thrusting her into the spotlight as the future sovereign. But legitimizing Charlotte was only half the battle. The far more difficult task was finding someone to marry her. This was the impossible riddle that kept the ministers of Monaco awake at night. They needed a husband who was a walking contradiction. He had to be of sufficiently high noble birth to satisfy the snobbish courts of Europe and the demanding French government, creating a veneer of legitimacy over Charlotte's scandalous origins. Yet, he also had to be desperate or compromised enough to agree to the humiliating terms of the contract. He would have to renounce his own ancient family name, adopt the surname Grimaldi, and effectively become a subordinate to his wife. No self-respecting royal prince from a ruling house would ever dream of accepting such a demotion. They needed a mercenary with a pedigree, a man who had the blood of kings, but the bank account of a pauper. Enter Pierre-Marie Xavier Raphael Antoine Melchior de Polignac. On paper, Pierre was the answer to a prayer. Born in 1895 in the misty, chateau-studded region of Brittany, he belonged to one of the most illustrious families in French history. The Polignacs had been the intimate confidants of Marie Antoinette, their name synonymous with the doomed glamour of the Ancien Regime. Pierre carried this history in his very bones. He was undeniably beautiful, with a delicate, fine-boned structure and heavy-lidded eyes that seemed to look past you with an air of tragic boredom. He was cultured, intellectual, and possessed an exquisite taste that made him a darling of the Parisian avant-garde. He could discuss the nuances of ballet with Diaghilev, debate literature with Proust, and critique the latest modernist paintings with Cocteau. He was the perfect specimen of the French aristocrat, elegant, witty, and utterly useless for anything practical. However, behind the polished facade of the Count de Polignac lay a reality of desperate insecurity. The Polignacs had prestige, but this branch of the family had very little money. Pierre was a butterfly count, fluttering through the high society salons of Paris, relying on his charm and his name to secure invitations to the right dinners and the right country houses. He was living a life of precarious luxury, terrified of the day when his fraying cuffs would become too noticeable or when the invitations would stop coming. But there was another, deeper reason why Pierre was vulnerable, a secret that was whispered about behind fans and over glasses of absinthe in the darker corners of Paris. Pierre was a man who preferred the company of men. In the artistic circles of 1920s Paris, homosexuality was an open secret, tolerably ignored as long as it was wrapped in the guise of eccentricity or aestheticism. Pierre moved in a world that was essentially a lavender underground populated by brilliant queer men who reshaped modern culture. He was not a man built for the traditional patriarchy of marriage and fatherhood. He was a creature of the night, of the salon, of the whispered confidence between male friends. But Pierre was also a snob. He craved social elevation as much as he craved artistic beauty. He looked at his life, a beautiful hollow shell of noble poverty, and he wanted more. He wanted the security and the power that only a crown could provide. He was, in essence, a man waiting for an offer he couldn't refuse. The matchmakers were not Cupid, but the cynical bureaucrats of the French foreign ministry and the desperate advisors of the Grimaldi family. They saw in Pierre the perfect candidate precisely because of his vulnerabilities. His poverty made him purchasable. His ambition made him pliable. And his sexuality, while a potential liability, made him unlikely to demand a passionate, controlling role in the marriage. He was safe. He was a decorative object to be placed on the throne next to the rough-edged Charlotte, a splash of blue blood to dilute the washerwoman genes that terrified the royal purists. The negotiations were conducted with the cold precision of a business merger. There was no courtship, no romantic walks along the harbor, no exchange of love letters. There were lawyers, contracts, and discussions about dowries and titles. When Pierre finally comprehended the true nature of the offer, the humiliation must have been absolute. He was not being courted, he was being hired. He was being hired to be a stud. The contract was explicit in its expectations, if not its language. He would marry Charlotte. He would abandon the name Polignac, a name that was his pride and joy, and he would become a Grimaldi. In exchange, he would receive the title of prince, a substantial allowance, and a life of immense privilege. But the core of the deal was biological. He had to produce an heir, specifically a male heir. Once that duty was fulfilled, his primary function would be complete. It was a Lavender marriage on a royal scale, a union designed not for companionship, but for political survival. For a man as proud and narcissistic as Pierre, it must have been a bitter pill to swallow, knowing that he was being bought for his genetic material, yet his vanity was such that the allure of being addressed as Your Serene Highness outweighed the humiliation. On the other side of this equation sat Charlotte. If Pierre was the reluctant seller, Charlotte was the resentful buyer. She was 22 years old, dragged from her life of relative freedom into the stifling cage of the Monegasque court. She was a woman of fire and earth, described by contemporaries as wild, loud, and utterly indifferent to the pretensions of the aristocracy. She hated the stuffy protocols that Pierre adored. She laughed loudly. She ate with gusto, and she yearned for a passion that was completely alien to the cool, detached man who had been chosen for her. When she looked at Pierre, she didn't see a savior. She saw a porcelain doll, a fragile, effeminate figure who looked at her with thinly veiled disdain. She knew, with the terrifying intuition of a woman trapped, that this man could never love her, not in the way she needed to be loved. The tragedy of their union was written before the ink on the marriage certificate was dry. The wedding took place in March 1920, a grand affair intended to signal to the world that the Grimaldi succession was secure. The crowds cheered, the flags waved, and the French government breathed a sigh of relief. But looking back at the photographs from that day, you can see the tension etched into their faces. Pierre looked stiff, his eyes focused on some distant point, performing the role of the prince with mechanical precision. Charlotte looks defiant, her body language pulling slightly away from him, a prisoner in lace and silk. They were actors in a play written by politicians, reciting lines they didn't believe, bound together by a legal document that stripped them of their humanity and reduced them to biological necessities. As they settled into life in the palace, the reality of their bargain began to set in. Pierre, now Prince Pierre, Duke of Valentinois, immediately set about trying to civilize the court. He brought his Parisian sensibilities to Monaco, commissioning artists, organizing concerts, and trying to turn the rocky fortress into a cultural salon. He treated Charlotte like a pupil who needed to be educated, criticizing her manners, her dress, and her conversation. He was the classic narcissist, projecting his own insecurities onto her, sneering at her common background to elevate his own sense of superiority. He surrounded himself with young male aides and secretaries, recreating the protective bubble of his bachelor days, leaving his wife isolated and bewildered in her own home. Charlotte, however, was not a woman to be tamed. She chafed under his criticism and ridiculed his pretensions. The palace became a battlefield of silence and slammed doors. The consummation of their marriage, that grim necessity required by the contract, was a duty that both reportedly found agonizing. For Pierre, it was a physical act that went against his very nature. For Charlotte, it was an intimacy with a man who looked at her with cold indifference. Yet the pressure was relentless. Every month that passed without a pregnancy was a diplomatic crisis. The French were watching. The Monegasque people were waiting. Pierre knew that his new title, his allowance, and his lavish lifestyle were all provisional. They depended entirely on his ability to perform the one act he found most difficult. This was the strange, suffocating atmosphere of the early 1920s in Monaco. A gay count playing the role of the alpha male patriarch, and a rebellious, illegitimate daughter playing the role of the demure princess. It was a charade that could only be sustained for so long. The cracks were there from the beginning, hairline fractures in the marble facade of the monarchy. They were two people drowning in a sea of expectations, clinging to each other not out of love but out of fear. Pierre feared poverty and irrelevance. Charlotte feared her father's wrath and the loss of her heritage. And so they remained locked in this desperate embrace, waiting for the child that would either set them free or bind them to their misery forever. The world saw a fairy tale, But within the palace walls, the stage was set for a domestic horror story of mutual resentment, sexual frustration, and a cold, calculating vengeance that would eventually tear the roof off the House of Grimaldi. The silence in the prince's palace following the wedding festivities felt less like a honeymoon and more like the heavy, suffocating stillness of a business office after a merger. The crowds had dispersed, the confetti had been swept from the streets of Monte Carlo, and the newly minted Prince Pierre and Princess Charlotte were left alone in the gilded cage of the Grimaldi dynasty. For Pierre, the reality of his new existence was a jarring shock. He had traded his precarious freedom in the bohemian cafes of Paris for the rigid, scrutinizing atmosphere of a court that viewed him with deep suspicion. He was the outsider, the Frenchman, the effete aristocrat who had been imported to do a job that no Monegasque man could do. And the nature of that job was inescapable. The pressure to produce an heir was not a subtle suggestion. It was a thundering command that echoed in every conversation, every glance from his father-in-law, Prince Louis II, and every dispatch from the French government. The survival of the principality hung on a biological thread, and Pierre was the instrument chosen to weave it. The intimacy required to fulfill this contract was, by all accounts, a grim and mechanical affair. For a man like Pierre, whose aesthetic and physical desires were fundamentally oriented toward men, the marital bed must have felt like a theater of war. He was performing a role that repulsed his true nature, forcing himself to embody a masculinity he did not feel, all under the watchful eyes of a dynasty desperate for a savior. Charlotte, with her sharp instincts and unbridled passion, surely sensed his hesitation, his detachment. To be touched by a husband who treats the act as a distasteful medical procedure is a humiliation that scars the soul. Yet both of them were trapped by the relentless logic of dynastic survival. They were not two lovers exploring a new life together. They were two employees clocking in for a shift in the reproductive factory of the state. The efficiency with which they executed this duty is perhaps the most chilling aspect of their early marriage. On December 28, 1920, barely 9 months after their wedding, the first dividend of their investment arrived. Princess Antoinette was born. The timing was impeccable, almost suspicious in its precision, proving that Pierre had wasted no time in fulfilling his contractual obligations. The birth was celebrated with cannon fire and public jubilation, but within the palace walls, the mood was likely one of mixed relief and anxiety. A daughter was a start, a proof of concept, but under the succession laws of the time, a daughter was not the ultimate insurance policy. The specter of the German cousin still loomed. The French government, while pleased, did not relax its grip. They needed a male heir. The pressure on Pierre did not dissipate. It intensified. He had proven he could do the job. Now he had to perfect it. For the next 2 years, the tension in the palace ratcheted up. Pierre and Charlotte were locked in a strange, suspended animation, united only by the cradle in the nursery and the expectations of the state. Outside the bedroom, their personalities began to clash with violent force. Pierre, emboldened by his new title and the birth of Antoinette, began to assert his vision for Monaco. He looked around the rough provincial court of the Grimaldis, a place of sailors, gamblers, and soldiers, and decided it needed to be civilized. He wanted to recreate the elegance of Versailles on the Mediterranean rock. He began commissioning art, inviting musicians, and imposing strict codes of etiquette that baffled the easygoing Monegasques. He corrected Charlotte's grammar in public, critiqued her clothing, and rolled his eyes at her loud laughter. He was trying to mold her into a Polignac, a creature of refined silence and poise, but he was carving against the grain of her very soul. Charlotte retaliated with the ferocity of a trapped animal. She mocked his airs and graces, calling him a porcelain doll and a dandy. She deliberately embraced her common side, spending time with the palace staff, speaking in the local dialect, and refusing to adhere to the rigid schedules Pierre tried to enforce. She saw his attempts to elevate the court as a direct insult to her father and her heritage. To Charlotte, Pierre was a pretentious fop who was spending her family's money to build a monument to his own vanity. To Pierre, Charlotte was an embarrassing reminder of the washerwoman blood that polluted the royal line, a wild creature that needed to be broken for her own good. They were oil and water forced into the same vessel, shaking with the tremors of their mutual disdain. Then on May 31st, 1923, the miracle happened. Prince Rainier was born. The relief that washed over the principality was palpable. The male heir had arrived. The dynasty was saved. The French ultimatum was nullified. For the first time in years, the Grimaldi could look to the future with absolute certainty. But for Pierre and Charlotte, the birth of their son marked the end of their marriage in everything but name. The contract was fulfilled. The heir and the spare had been produced. There was no longer any political or dynastic reason for Pierre to force himself into Charlotte's bed, nor for Charlotte to endure his cold touch. According to persistent rumors and the trajectory of their later lives, the physical relationship between the prince and princess of Monaco ceased almost the moment Rainier drew his first breath. The bedroom door closed, locked by mutual consent and mutual exhaustion. With the biological imperative removed, Pierre felt a surge of liberation. He had paid his dues. He had secured his title, his allowance, and his place in history. He was now the father of the future sovereign prince. In his mind, he had earned the right to live as he pleased. He began to drift away from the suffocating atmosphere of the palace, turning his gaze back toward the city that held his heart, Paris. The French capital was roaring in the 1920s, a kaleidoscope of jazz, modernism, and sexual liberation, and Pierre was eager to return to the circles where he was understood, admired, and desired. He became a commuter prince, spending weeks at a time in his elegant Parisian apartment, leaving Charlotte alone in Monaco with the children. In Paris, Pierre de Polignac shed the heavy skin of the Grimaldi consort and reclaimed his identity as the aesthetic aristocrat. He was a prominent figure in the homosocial elite, a network of powerful, wealthy, and artistic men who moved through the city's salons like a secret society. He renewed his close friendship with Marcel Proust, whose sprawling novel In Search of Lost Time dissected the very social ambition and sexual secrets that defined Pierre's life. He became a patron of the Ballets Russes, the avant-garde dance company led by Sergei Diaghilev, a man who lived openly as a homosexual and whose productions were celebrated for their homoerotic subtext. Pierre poured Grimaldi money into these ventures, funding productions, commissioning scores, and supporting young male artists who caught his eye. He was living a double life of extraordinary complexity. To the public, he was the dutiful Prince of Monaco, a patron of the arts who was bringing culture to the Riviera. To his private circle, he was one of them, a man who understood the codes of the Lavender underground. He was careful, of course. The laws were one thing, but social scandal was another. He could not be seen in the wrong bars or with the wrong types of men. His companions were always impeccably dressed, artistically inclined, and socially presentable, He masked his desires in the language of mentorship and patronage. A young violinist he supported was just a protégé. A handsome poet he dined with was just a collaborator. It was a dance of shadows, a performance of plausible deniability that Pierre executed with the grace of a seasoned diplomat. Back in Monaco, Charlotte was left to stew in her isolation. She was a woman in the prime of her life, vibrant, sexual, and deeply lonely. She saw her husband using her family's fortune to fund a life in Paris from which she was excluded. She knew, with the stinging clarity of a rejected wife, that the money was also funding his relationships with other men. The porcelain doll wasn't just cold. He was indifferent to her existence now that she had served her purpose. The insult was profound. He had used her body to secure his crown, and now he was discarding her like a used wrapper. The palace, once a prison, now felt like a tomb. She had the children, yes, but even there, Pierre tried to exert his control. He insisted on governesses, tutors, and strict protocols for Antoinette and Rainier, trying to mold them into little Polignacs, distancing them from their mother's rough influence. The tension began to leak out into the public sphere. The staff whispered about the shouting matches that echoed through the corridors when Pierre deigned to visit. They noticed the separate bedrooms, the separate schedules, the way the prince and princess would stand on opposite sides of a room at official functions, their smiles tight and their eyes hard. Pierre's arrogance grew with his distance. He began to treat the Grimaldis, including his father-in-law, the ruling Prince Louis, with a thinly veiled condescension. He acted as if he were the only civilized person on the rock, a missionary among savages. He forgot in his hubris that he was a guest in their house, an employee who had been given a promotion, not a conqueror who had won a war. Charlotte, pushed to the breaking point, began to look for an escape. If Pierre could have his life in Paris, why couldn't she have hers? She was the hereditary princess. The blood of the Grimaldis ran in her veins, not his. She began to assert her independence in ways that shocked the conservative court. She drove fast cars, she wore daring fashions, and she began to surround herself with a circle of friends who were far removed from Pierre's intellectual snobs. She was testing the boundaries of her cage, rattling the bars, daring her husband or her father to stop her. The wild child of Algeria was reawakening, and this time she was armed with the bitterness of a betrayed wife. By the mid-1920s, the breeding contract had essentially dissolved into a Cold War. Pierre was spending more and more time away, crafting a life of aesthetic perfection in France, believing he was untouchable. He was the father of the heir. His position was surely secure. He underestimated the fury of a woman's scorn, and he underestimated the ruthlessness of the Grimaldi family when their survival was no longer at stake. He had given them the heir they needed. Now he was becoming a liability. The whispers about his sexuality, once confined to the artistic salons of Paris, began to drift south, carried on the breeze of gossip. Every time he was seen with a handsome young secretary, every time he spent a fortune on a male dancer's career, the rumor mill churned. In the conservative Catholic stronghold of Monaco, a prince consort with unnatural inclinations was a ticking time bomb. The tragedy of this period lies in the absolute lack of emotional connection between the couple. There was no attempt at counseling, no mediation, no softening of hearts. It was a transactional relationship that had reached the end of its term. Pierre viewed Charlotte as an obstacle to his refined life. Charlotte viewed Pierre as a thief who had stolen her freedom and her dignity. They were tied together only by the two children in the nursery, innocent pawns in a game of dynastic chess. Little Rainier and Antoinette grew up in this atmosphere of chilled silence, watching their parents drift apart like continents separating, unaware that the fault lines beneath their feet were about to trigger a devastating earthquake. As the decade wore on, the pretense of a happy royal marriage became impossible to sustain. Pierre's visits became rarer and shorter. When he was in Monaco, he was often seen walking alone in the gardens, a solitary figure lost in thought, perhaps dreaming of the boys in the Parisian cafes, or perhaps regretting the bargain he had made. He had the crown, he had the title, but he had lost his freedom in a way he hadn't anticipated. He was a prince, yes, but he was also a prisoner of his own ambition. And Charlotte, watching him from the palace windows, was no longer the frightened girl who had agreed to the marriage. She was a woman growing into her power, and she was sharpening her knives. The era of the breeding stud was over. The era of the revenge of the princess was about to begin. The silence of the palace was about to be broken by the sound of a scandal that would rock the foundations of the throne Pierre thought he had saved. If the early years of the marriage were a cold war fought in the silence of the palace corridors, the late 1920s marked the moment the conflict turned hot, public, and devastating. The facade of the happy royal family, so carefully constructed by French diplomats and hopeful courtiers, began to crumble not from external pressure, but from the sheer force of Princess Charlotte's rage. She had spent a decade playing the role of the dutiful wife to a man who viewed her with thinly veiled contempt, a man who treated her as a biological necessity rather than a human being. She had given him the heir he required. She had secured his title and his fortune, and in return, she had received nothing but icy politeness and a husband who preferred the company of Parisian artists to his own wife. The contract was fulfilled, and Charlotte, with the reckless courage of her ancestors, decided it was time to renegotiate the terms. The catalyst for this explosion was a personal reclamation of desire rather than a political crisis. Charlotte was 30 years old, a woman of immense vitality and passion who had been starved of affection for a third of her life. She was done waiting for crumbs from Pierre's table. She looked outside the suffocating walls of the palace and found what she was looking for in the arms of an Italian doctor named Dalmazzo. This was not a discreet, shadow-filled affair like the ones Pierre conducted in Paris. Charlotte did not hide. She did not use codes or intermediaries. She flaunted her lover with a brazenness that stunned the conservative society of Monaco. She moved out of the palace and into a villa, living openly with Dalmazzo, driving around the Riviera with him, and challenging anyone, her father, her husband, the church, to stop her. For Pierre, this was a catastrophe. He had assumed that the arrangement would continue indefinitely. He would live his elegant double life in Paris. Charlotte would remain the docile mother figure in Monaco, and they would come together for official photographs. He had underestimated her completely. He viewed her as unrefined and simple, failing to see the dangerous pride that burned within her. When she took a lover so publicly, she wasn't just seeking comfort, she was humiliating him. In the patriarchal code of the aristocracy, a wife's infidelity was a direct reflection on the husband's masculinity and authority. Pierre, who had spent years cultivating an image of supreme, untouchable dignity, suddenly found himself the object of pity and ridicule. The stud of the Grimaldis couldn't even keep his wife in check. The situation escalated from a domestic scandal to a constitutional crisis. Prince Louis II, the gruff old soldier who ruled Monaco, was initially furious with his daughter's indiscretion. But as the tug-of-war intensified, a primal instinct kicked in. Blood is thicker than water. Pierre was, after all, an employee. He was a Polignac, not a Grimaldi. He was the foreigner who had been hired to do a job. Charlotte was Louis's flesh and blood, the child of his great love, the future of his house. When forced to choose between the son-in-law who looked down on him and the daughter who defied him, Louis ultimately sided with Charlotte. The protection that Pierre thought he had earned, the unshakable status of being the father of the heir, began to evaporate. It was in this toxic atmosphere that the jewel scandal erupted, a sordid accusation that would stain Pierre's reputation for the rest of his life. The details remain murky, buried under decades of royal non-disclosure agreements and destroyed documents, but the core of the rumor was explosive. Charlotte accused Pierre of theft. Specifically, she claimed that he had taken valuable pieces of jewelry, heirlooms of the house of Grimaldi, or gifts given to her, and had spirited them away to Paris. But the accusation had a second, sharper edge. She alleged that he hadn't just stolen them for money, but that he had given them as gifts to his male lovers. Whether this was literally true or a metaphorical weaponization of his financial dependence is almost irrelevant. The accusation was a masterstroke of cruelty. It targeted Pierre's two greatest vulnerabilities, his lack of personal wealth and his hidden sexuality. It painted him not as the noble prince consort, but as a parasitic gigolo, a man who stripped his wife of her treasures to adorn his illicit partners. It was a story that confirmed every prejudice the Monegasque people held against him. To them, he was the effete Frenchman who was looting their principality to fund his degenerate lifestyle in the capital. The rumors spread like wildfire, from the fish markets of La Condamine to the casinos of Monte Carlo. Pierre was no longer the savior. He was the thief. Pierre's reaction was one of frozen horror. He attempted to maintain his composure, issuing stiff denials and refusing to engage in public mudslinging. But he was outmatched. Charlotte was fighting a total war. She demanded a separation. She wanted him out of her life, out of her palace, and out of her finances. The negotiations that followed were brutal. The French government, terrified once again that the Grimaldi dynasty would implode, tried to intervene. They urged caution, they urged reconciliation, they urged silence. But the marriage was dead, and the corpse was rotting in public view. On March 20th, 1930, exactly 10 years, and one day after their religious wedding, a legal separation was pronounced. It was a grim anniversary. Pierre was effectively evicted from the inner sanctum of power. He retained his titles, Prince Pierre of Monaco, Duke of Valentinois, because to strip him of them would be to delegitimize the children he had fathered. But he lost his home. He moved into a hotel in Paris, a prince in exile, living on an allowance that was now subject to the whims of the wife he despised. The hired gun had been fired, but because he knew where the bodies were buried, he was kept on a retainer. The separation, however, was not enough for Charlotte. She wanted a divorce. She wanted to be legally free of the man she called a mistake. In the eyes of the Catholic Church, divorce was impossible. They were married until death. But in the eyes of the French civil law, which governed the personal status of the Grimaldis, it was possible. The legal battle that ensued in 1933 was the final act of this tragic opera. It was here that the full extent of the Lavender marriage failure was laid bare. The court documents, though couched in legal euphemisms, painted a picture of a union that had been a sham from the start. The grounds for divorce were ostensibly grievous insults and incompatibility, but everyone knew what that meant. It meant Pierre's refusal to share a bed with his wife. It meant his long absences in Paris. It meant the separate lives they had led for a decade. The court in Monaco, under the direction of Prince Louis, granted the divorce by sovereign ordinance. It was a stunning exercise of royal power. Louis essentially decreed the marriage over, bypassing the messy public testimony that would have aired the family's dirty laundry. He cut the knot with a sword. On February 18, 1933, Pierre de Polignac became the first prince in European history to be divorced by sovereign decree. He was 37 years old. He had given 13 years of his life to the Grimaldi. He had fathered the heir and the spare, and now he was cast adrift. The settlement allowed him to keep his title and a generous financial stipend, reportedly 500,000 francs a year, a massive sum at the time, but the cost was his dignity. He was officially the former husband. He was the father of the future prince, but he had no legal authority over his children. Antoinette and Rainier were wards of the state, raised by their grandfather and the palace staff. Pierre was granted visitation rights, but he was a visitor in the lives of his own children. The psychological impact on Pierre was profound. He retreated further into his armor of snobbery. He told his friends in Paris that he was relieved to be free of the vulgarity of Monaco. He threw himself into his art patronage with renewed vigor, as if trying to wash away the stain of the divorce with culture. He became a member of the International Olympic Committee. He advised UNESCO. He surrounded himself with writers and philosophers. He tried to build a life that was purely aesthetic, purely intellectual, a life where biology and dynasties didn't matter. But the shadow of Monaco was long. He was always Prince Pierre, the man who had married the washerwoman's daughter. He could never truly go back to being just Count de Polignac. He was a hybrid creature, trapped between two worlds, belonging to neither. For Charlotte, the divorce was a Pyrrhic victory. She was free of Pierre, but she was not free of the burden of her station. Her affair with Dalmazzo eventually fizzled out, as passions often do when they are no longer fueled by rebellion. She was left alone in the palace, a divorced princess in a Catholic Europe that viewed such things with horror. She became increasingly eccentric, turning her attention to social work and prison reform, trying to find meaning in a life that had been scripted for her before she was born. She had won the war against Pierre, but she had destroyed the family unit in the process. The real casualties of this war, however, were the children. Rainier was 10 years old when his parents divorced. He had spent his entire conscious life watching them tear each other apart. He had seen his father's cold indifference and his mother's fiery rage. He had heard the whispers of the servants and seen the scandalous headlines in the newspapers. He was a sensitive, lonely boy, shuttled between a boarding school in England and a palace that felt like a battlefield. He adored his mother, but he was confused by her erratic behavior. He respected his father's intellect, but he was terrified of his judgment. Pierre, in his visits, was critical and distant, treating his son like a disappointing student rather than a child who needed comfort. He tried to mold Rainier into a refined intellectual, ignoring the boy's need for simple affection. The divorce crystallized a dynamic that would haunt Rainier for the rest of his life. He learned that marriage was a trap. He learned that duty came before happiness. He learned that feelings were dangerous things that should be hidden behind a wall of protocol. The Grimaldi curse, the legend that no Grimaldi would ever find true happiness in marriage, seemed to be playing out in real time before his eyes. Pierre had done his job too well. He had produced an heir, but he had also produced a damaged young man who would ascend the throne with a heart full of scar tissue. As the 1930s darkened into the pre-war years, Pierre found himself in a strange limbo. He was a man with a royal title but no kingdom. He was a father with no family. He was a gay man in a world that was becoming increasingly hostile to deviance as fascism rose in Europe. He continued to play the role of the elegant bon vivant, hosting dinners for Cocteau and browsing the antique shops of the left bank, but there was a hollowness to his existence. He was living on the pension of the family that had discarded him. Every franc he spent on a rare book or a beautiful young companion was a reminder of the transaction he had made in 1920. He had sold his seed, and this was his payment. The tragedy of Pierre de Polignac is that he thought he could outsmart the system. He thought he could use the Grimaldi to fund his lifestyle while keeping his soul intact. He thought he could be a part-time husband and a full-time aesthete. He was wrong. The system, the ruthless biological imperative of hereditary monarchy, had consumed him. It had taken what it needed and spat out the rest. He was walking proof that you cannot enter a Lavender marriage with a dynasty and expect to leave with your dignity unscathed. He had saved the house of Grimaldi, but in the process he had lost himself. And as Europe marched toward another war and his son Rainier moved closer to the throne, Pierre would find that his exile was far from over. The final act of his humiliation was yet to come, delivered not by his wife, but by the very son he had been hired to create. The decade following the divorce was a period of deceptive calm, a long, suffocating intermission before the final act of the Grimaldi tragedy. Pierre de Polignac, now approaching his 40s, settled into a life of gilded exile in Paris. He was a man without a country, a prince without a principality, suspended in a solution of exquisite taste and profound loneliness. He had his apartment near the Bois de Boulogne, his box at the opera, and his circle of admiring young men who laughed at his witticisms and enjoyed his generosity. To the casual observer, he was the very picture of the successful aristocrat, wealthy, cultured, and liberated from the burden of a loveless marriage. But beneath the velvet smoking jackets and the perfectly knotted ties, Pierre was a man haunted by the transaction that had defined his existence. He was living on the stud fee he had earned in 1920, and every franc he spent was a reminder that his value to the world had been purely biological. His relationship with his son, the young Prince Rainier, became the primary theater of his frustration. Pierre looked at the boy and saw a project that needed managing, a lump of raw clay that required the refining touch of a Polignac. He was appalled by what he saw as the Grimaldi coarseness emerging in the child. Rainier was stocky, prone to outbursts of temper, and uninterested in the subtle nuances of French literature or the delicate phrasing of a Chopin nocturne. He was in Pierre's eyes terrifyingly similar to his mother, Charlotte, and his grandfather, Louis, earthy, stubborn, and utterly lacking in aesthetic sensibility. Pierre tried to counter this by bombarding the boy with letters from Paris, long lecturing missives that dissected Rainier's grammar, criticized his penmanship, and offered unsolicited advice on how to be a gentleman. He was trying to parent by correspondence, attempting to mold a sovereign prince into a replica of a Parisian dandy. Rainier, exiled to a series of bleak boarding schools in England and Switzerland, hated these letters. He was a lonely, overweight child, bullied by his peers for his foreign title and his chubbiness, and ignored by a mother who was busy chasing her own chaotic happiness. He craved affection, warmth, and a father who would play catch or tell him he was proud. Instead, he got Pierre, a distant, critical voice who treated him like a disappointing employee. Rainier later described his childhood as a vacuum of love, a time when he felt like an object of state rather than a human being. He knew, with the instinctive cruelty of children, that his father found him common. The rejection festered, turning into a deep-seated resentment that would shape the future of the monarchy. Pierre had given Rainier life, but he withheld the one thing that might have earned him loyalty: love. Then came the war. World War II shattered the fragile cosmopolitan bubble in which Pierre lived. The German occupation of France and the uneasy neutrality of Monaco threw everyone's roles into sharp relief. Pierre, ever the pragmatist, navigated the occupation with the same detached elegance he applied to everything else. He stayed in Paris, moving through the gray zones of collaborationist society, associating with figures who found it convenient to be friendly with the German occupiers. He was not a political ideologue. He was simply a man who refused to be inconvenienced by history. He protected his friends, some of whom were Jewish or resistance fighters, but he also dined with those in power. It was a murky, morally ambiguous existence that further alienated him from his son. Rainier took a different path. In 1944, defying his grandfather's wishes and his father's indifference, the young heir joined the French army. He wanted to fight. He wanted to wash away the stain of his family's neutrality and prove that he was a man of action, not a pampered prince. He served with the distinction in the Alsace campaign, earning the Croix de Guerre and the Bronze Star. For the first time in his life, Rainier found a sense of belonging among soldiers, men who judged him by his courage rather than his pedigree. He returned from the front transformed. He was no longer the fat, lonely boy Pierre had lectured. He was a hardened young man who had seen death and learned the value of command. The gap between father and son was now a chasm. Pierre was the effete intellectual of the salons. Rainier was the warrior prince. The Grimaldi side had won the battle for the boy's soul. The reckoning arrived in 1949. Prince Louis II, the old soldier who had brokered the breeding contract 30 years earlier, died on May 9th. At that moment, the 26-year-old Rainier became the sovereign prince of Monaco. The power dynamic shifted with the violence of a guillotine blade dropping. Overnight, Pierre ceased to be the father of a minor. He became the subject of an absolute monarch. He had assumed, with his characteristic arrogance, that Rainier would need him. He envisioned himself as the power behind the throne, the wise regent who would guide his inexperienced son through the treacherous waters of politics. He prepared to return to Monaco in triumph, ready to take his rightful place at the head of the table. He was wrong. Rainier III had no intention of being a puppet. He had spent his life watching his parents destroy each other, and his grandfather let the principality rot into a faded gambling den. He had his own vision for Monaco, a vision of modernization and iron-fisted control, and it did not include a father who had spent 3 decades looking down his nose at the country. When Pierre attempted to offer advice on cabinet appointments and protocol, Rainier cut him off cold. The message was brutal and unambiguous. I am the prince. You are the past. Rainier didn't just ignore Pierre. He actively marginalized him. He made it clear that while Pierre was welcome to visit, he held no official authority. The hired hand was reminded once again that his contract had expired. The humiliation of this period was intense. Pierre found himself in the bizarre position of having to bow to his own son. He had to request audiences, wait in the antechambers, and stand when Rainier entered the room. For a man of Pierre's vanity, this was a torture worse than death. He saw the courtiers who had once feared him now looking through him, their eyes fixed on the young chain-smoking sovereign who held the checkbook. Pierre tried to compensate by throwing himself into international organizations. He became Monaco's representative to UNESCO and the International Olympic Committee, roles that gave him a fancy title and a reason to travel, but kept him safely away from the levers of real power. Rainier was happy to let him have these scraps. They kept Pierre busy and out of Monaco, where his presence was a constant reminder of the dysfunctional past. But the cruelest twist of the knife was yet to come. In the early 1950s, Rainier began to think about his own marriage. He was facing the exact same pressure his father had faced, the need for an heir. The survival of the dynasty was once again on the line, but Rainier was determined to do it differently. He would not have a Lavender marriage. He would not be brokered like a prize bull. He wanted a partner. Pierre watched from the sidelines as his son romanced the French actress Gisèle Pascal. The relationship was passionate and real. Everything Pierre's marriage to Charlotte had not been. Pierre, true to form, disapproved. He whispered that an actress was unsuitable, that she was common. He allied himself with his daughter, Princess Antoinette, a master schemer who wanted the throne for her own son, to undermine Rainier's relationship. It was a pathetic, destructive game. Pierre, the man who had been bought for his bloodline, was now using that same obsession with lineage to sabotage his son's happiness. Rumors were planted that Gisèle was infertile. The pressure worked and Rainier ended the relationship, heartbroken. Pierre had won a small, spiteful victory, but it cost him whatever shreds of affection remained between him and his son. Rainier saw his father not as a guardian of tradition, but as a bitter, jealous man who would rather see his son miserable than happy with a commoner. The irony was staggering. The gay father who had been forced into a loveless union was now enforcing the same rigid rules on his straight son. Then came Grace Kelly. When Rainier met the American movie star in 1955, the world swooned. It was the romances of the century. But for Pierre, it was a complex pill to swallow. Grace was beautiful, yes. She was rich, yes, but she was an American. She was an actress. Her father was a bricklayer who had made a fortune in construction. In the snobbish hierarchy of the Polignacs, the Kellys were nouveau riche upstarts. Yet Pierre knew he had lost the power to object. Rainier was infatuated, and more importantly, Grace was the perfect marketing coup for a principality that was losing money. The marriage was set for April 1956. Pierre's role in the wedding of the century was that of a glorified extra. He walked in the processions. He wore his medals. He smiled for the cameras. But he was a ghost at the feast. In the official photographs, you can see him standing slightly apart, a tall, elegant figure with a face that betrays nothing. He watched his son marry for love, or at least for a mutual ambition that included respect and attraction, and he must have felt the crushing weight of his own history. He had walked down a similar aisle 36 years earlier, but his heart had been cold, his mind filled with calculations about debt and duty. He saw Rainier looking at Grace with a hunger and a pride that Pierre had never felt for Charlotte. It was the ultimate exclusion. The breeding stud was watching the next generation replicate his work, but with the one ingredient he had never possessed: passion. After the wedding, Pierre retreated further into the shadows. He spent his final years as a wanderer, moving between his apartment in Paris and the homes of his aristocratic friends. He was a relic of a bygone era, a man who spoke a language of etiquette and refinement that the modern world had forgotten. He had money thanks to the Grimaldi allowance, but he had no home. He was a prince of Monaco who felt like a stranger in the palace. His relationship with Charlotte had settled into a distant, icy truce. They rarely spoke, avoiding each other like two veterans of a war who cannot bear to look at the enemy. His health began to fail in the early 1960s. Cancer, the great leveler, began to eat away at the elegant frame that had been his ticket to royalty. As he lay dying in the American hospital in Paris in 1964, one wonders what thoughts passed through the mind of Count Pierre de Polignac. Did he regret the bargain he had made in 1920? Did he regret selling his name for a crown? Or did he look at the stability of Monaco, at the thriving dynasty he had secured, and tell himself it was worth it? He had saved a kingdom. He had produced a line of kings. He had done his job. But the room was quiet. The applause of the salons had faded. The lovers of his youth were gone or old. He was alone with the consequences of his ambition. When news of his death reached Monaco, Prince Rainier ordered a state funeral. It was the final irony. The father who had been marginalized in life was celebrated in death with the full honors of the state. The flags were lowered to half-mast. The cannon fired the salute. Pierre's body was brought back to the rock, to the very cathedral where he had married Charlotte. He was laid to rest in the Grimaldi family vault, buried alongside the wife he despised and the ancestors he had never known. The hired hand was finally given permanent residency. He had become in death what he never truly was in life, a Grimaldi. But the story didn't end with the closing of the tomb. The legacy of Pierre's Lavender contract lived on in the psychology of his son. Rainier ruled Monaco for 56 years, transforming it into a fortress of wealth, but he did so as a man deeply scarred by the lovelessness of his origins. He was a sovereign who built high walls around his heart, just as he built high rises on the coast. He was the product of a transaction, and he ran his principality like a business. The ghost of Pierre, the elegant, cold, secretly gay father, haunted the corridors of the palace, a reminder that the House of Grimaldi was built on a foundation of secrets, sacrifices, and a silence that screamed. The death of Prince Pierre in 1964 did not bring an end to the Grimaldi problem. It merely buried one half of the dysfunctional equation in the family crypt. The surviving half, Princess Charlotte, lived on for another 13 years, a ghost haunting the fringes of the dynasty she had reluctantly helped to save. If Pierre's later years were defined by a dignified, icy silence, Charlotte's were marked by a chaotic, eccentric decline that was perhaps even more tragic. She had spent her youth fighting against the constraints of her royal cage, but in her old age she found herself trapped in a prison of her own making. She had won her freedom from the porcelain doll, but she had never found the peace she craved. She lived in a large apartment in the 7th arrondissement of Paris, surrounded by a menagerie of stray dogs and cats, a princess of the people who had become a recluse. The woman who had once scandalized Europe with her lovers and her loud laughter became a strange, solitary figure. She turned her back on the glitter of Monaco, focusing instead on social work, visiting prisons, and advocating for the rehabilitation of criminals. It was a noble pursuit, but one born of a deep psychological identification with the outcast. Charlotte, the illegitimate daughter legitimized by decree, the wife rejected by a gay husband, the mother estranged from her son, saw herself in the prisoners she visited. She, too, was serving a life sentence, confined by a title she never asked for and a history she couldn't escape. When she died in 1977, lonely and largely forgotten by the new jet-set generation, the circle of the breeding contract was finally physically closed. The two people who had been forced together to manufacture a bloodline were gone, leaving behind only the cold, hard reality of the dynasty they had preserved. But the true legacy of Pierre de Polignac was not found in the silence of his grave or the eccentricity of his ex-wife. It was etched into the psyche of the son who now ruled supreme. Prince Rainier III was the undisputed master of Monaco, a man who would go down in history as the builder prince. He poured concrete over the Belle Epoque charm of the principality, erecting skyscrapers, reclaiming land from the sea, and turning the sleepy gambling resort into a fortress of global finance. It is impossible to look at Rainier's aggressive, almost brutal modernization of Monaco without seeing a rejection of his father's world. Pierre had loved delicate art, subtle music, and the fragile beauty of the past. Rainier loved construction cranes, balance sheets, and the tangible power of stone and steel. He was trying to build a Monaco that was too strong, too rich, and too modern to be hurt by the kind of whispered scandals that had destroyed his childhood. Rainier ruled with a heavy hand, a direct reaction to the weakness he perceived in his father. He viewed Pierre's aestheticism as a liability, a softness that had almost cost the family its throne. Rainier's Monaco was masculine, corporate, and disciplined. He suppressed the Polignac side of his nature, the artistic, the sensitive, and amplified the Grimaldi toughness. He became the anti-Pierre. Yet in his private life, the scars were visible. His marriage to Grace Kelly, the wedding of the century, was in many ways a desperate attempt to correct the errors of 1920. He sought a perfect, photogenic, undeniably heterosexual union to wipe away the memory of his parents' Lavender sham. He wanted a partner, not a contract. And for a while, he had it. The world fell in love with Rainier and Grace, the fairy tale couple who made Monaco the center of the universe. However, the Grimaldi curse, that persistent legend that no member of the family would find happiness in marriage, seemed to laugh at his efforts. The pressure of the crown, the relentless scrutiny of the press, and the claustrophobia of the palace weighed heavily on Grace, just as they had on Charlotte. The difference was that Grace was a professional. She played the role of the serene princess with an Oscar-winning discipline that Charlotte never possessed. But the underlying sadness was there, the isolation of living in a gilded fishbowl. When Princess Grace died in that horrific car crash in 1982, the illusion shattered. Rainier was left broken, a lonely old man trapped in the fortress he had built, mourning a wife who had been his only true shield against the demons of his past. In his grief, he began to look more and more like Pierre, silent, distant, his eyes filled with a profound aristocratic melancholy. The builder prince had concreted over the landscape, but he couldn't concrete over the DNA. As the 20th century turned into the 21st, the iron grip of censorship that had protected Pierre's reputation began to loosen. During Rainier's lifetime, the subject of Pierre's homosexuality was a strict taboo in Monaco. Biographers were discouraged from digging too deep. Archives were kept sealed. Pierre was officially remembered as a patron of the arts, a vague euphemism that covered a multitude of sins. But with Rainier's death in 2005 and the accession of his son, Prince Albert II, the truth began to seep out. Historians armed with diaries from the Parisian circles of Cocteau and Proust began to reconstruct the reality of Pierre's life. The open secret of the 1920s became historical fact. The narrative shifted from the story of a difficult marriage to the story of a Lavender marriage, a transactional arrangement between a desperate state and a gay man. This reevaluation changed the way we understand the survival of the Grimaldis. Pierre was no longer seen as the villain who made Charlotte miserable, nor as the hero who saved the throne. He was revealed as a victim of a ruthless system. He was a man born with a nature that was criminalized by the laws of his time and stigmatized by his class. He had sold the only thing of value he possessed, his name and his fertility, to buy a life of safety and prestige. It was a Faustian bargain, and like all such bargains, the devil eventually came to collect. He had lived in fear of exposure, in fear of poverty, and in fear of his own son. The patron of the arts was a mask worn by a man who was terrified of being seen for who he really was. The irony of this legacy is most visible in the current sovereign, Prince Albert II. If Rainier was the anti-Pierre, Albert is in many ways his grandfather's spiritual twin. He is soft-spoken, intellectual, deeply concerned with environmentalism and culture, and famously hesitant about the macho posturing of the throne. For years, Albert himself was the subject of intense speculation regarding his bachelorhood, echoing the whispers that had dogged Pierre. When Albert finally married Princess Charlene and produced heirs, it felt like a replay of the dynastic anxiety that had gripped the rock a century earlier. The Grimaldi bloodline, seemingly always hanging by a thread, had managed to pull off the trick one more time. But look closely at Albert's face, at the set of his eyes and the bridge of his nose. He is a Polignac. The stud did his job well. The genetic imprint of the gay count is stamped on the face of the modern monarchy. Ultimately, the story of Prince Pierre serves as a brutal deconstruction of the fairy tale myth. He was the gay man who allowed a dynasty to pretend it was straight, the impoverished aristocrat who allowed it to pretend it was rich in blood. Today, a statue of Pierre stands in the palace gardens, depicting an elegant young man looking out to sea. Tourists pass it daily, unaware that the bronze figure represents a torrent of misery and a transaction that stripped a man of his soul. The house of Grimaldi now stands tall and glittering in the Mediterranean sun, a monument to wealth and power. But its foundation is built on the bones of this butterfly count, who sold his freedom for a crown, and the wild princess broken to make him a king. As we look back from the safety of the 21st century, we can finally give him the title he truly earned, the one never carved onto his tombstone, the Prince of Solitude. He walked alone so that his descendants could walk in crowds, and in the ruthless calculus of history, that is the only metric that matters. The stud fees were paid. The line continues. The deal is closed.